units in our main chip. The flash controller in the SSD was designed for smooth and bottleneck-free operation, but also with games in mind. For example, there are 6 levels of priority when reading from the SSD. Priority is very important. You can imagine the player heading into some new location in the world and the game requesting a few gigabytes of textures. And while those textures are being loaded, an enemy is shot and has to speak a few dying words. Having multiple priority levels lets the audio for those dying words get loaded immediately. On one side, that flash controller connects to the actual flash dies that supply the storage. To reach our bandwidth target of 5 gigabytes a second, we ended up with a 12-channel interface. 8 channels wouldn't be enough. The resulting bandwidth we've achieved is actually 5.5 gigabytes a second. With a 12-channel interface, the most natural size that emerges for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add more, but flash certainly doesn't come cheap, and we have a responsibility to our gaming audience to be cost-effective with regards to what we put in the console. Ultimately, we resolved this question by looking at the play patterns of a broad range of gamers. We examined the specific games that they were playing over the course of a weekend or a week or a month, and whether that set of games would fit properly on the SSD. We were able to establish that the friction caused by reinstalls or redownloads would be quite low, and so we locked in on that 825 gigabyte size, while also preparing multiple strategies so that those who want more storage can add it. I'll go through the details in a moment. Back to the flash controller. On the other side, it connects to our main custom chip via 4 lanes of Gen 4 PCIe. And inside the main custom chip is a pretty hefty unit dedicated to I/O. Before we talk about what that does, let's talk compression for a moment. PlayStation 4 used zlib as its compression format. We decided to use it again on PlayStation 5, but on my 2017 tour of developers, I learned about a new format called Kraken from Rad Game Tools. It's like zlib's smarter cousin. Similar types of algorithms, but about 10% better compression, which is pretty big. That means 10% more game on the UHD Blu-ray disc or on the SSD. Kraken had only been out for a year, but it was already becoming a de facto industry standard. Half of the teams I talked to were either using it or getting ready to evaluate it. So we hustled and built a custom decompressor into the I/O unit, one capable of handling over 5 gigabytes of Kraken format input data a second. After decompression, that typically becomes 8 or 9 gigabytes, but the unit itself is capable of outputting as much as 22 gigabytes a second if the data happen to compress particularly well. By the way, in terms of performance, that custom decompressor equates to 9 of our Zen 2 cores. That's what it would take to decompress the Kraken stream with a conventional CPU. There's a lot more in the custom I/O unit, including a dedicated DMA controller. The game can direct exactly where it wants to send the data coming off of the SSD. This equates to another Zen 2 core or 2 in terms of its copy performance. Its primary purpose is to remove check-in as a bottleneck. There's 2 dedicated I/O coprocessors and a large RAM pool. These aren't Zen 2 cores. They're there principally to direct the variety of custom hardware around them. One of the coprocessors is dedicated to SSD I/O. This lets us bypass traditional file I/O and its bottlenecks when reading from the SSD. The other is responsible for memory mapping, which I know doesn't sound like anything related to the SSD, but a lot of developers map and remap memory as part of file I/O, and this too can become a bottleneck. There are coherency engines to assist the coprocessors. Coherency comes up a lot of places. Probably the biggest coherency issue is stale data in the GPU caches. Flushing all of the GPU caches whenever the SSD is read is an unattractive option. It could really hurt the GPU performance. So we've implemented a gentler way of doing things, where the coherency engines inform the GPU of the overwritten address ranges, and custom scrubbers in several dozen GPU caches do pinpoint evictions of just those address ranges. The best thing is, as a game developer, when you read from the SSD, you don't need to know any of this. You don't even need to know that your data is compressed. You just indicate what data you'd like to read from your original uncompressed file and where you'd like to put it, and the whole process of loading it happens invisibly to you and at very high speed. Back to the dream. thanks to all of that surrounding hardware, our 5.5 gigabytes a second really should translate into something like 100 times faster I/O than PS4, and allow the dream of no load screens and super fast streaming to become a reality. Having said that, expandability of our SSD is going to be quite important. Flash is costly, and you may very well want to add storage to whatever we put in the console. Now, the kind of storage you need depends on how you're going to use it. If you have an extensive PlayStation 4 library and you'd like to take advantage of backwards compatibility to play those games on PlayStation 5, then a large external hard drive is ideal. You can leave your games on the hard drive and play them directly from there, thus saving the pricier SSD storage for your PlayStation 5 titles, or you can copy your active PlayStation 4 titles to the SSD. If your purpose in adding more storage is to play PlayStation 5 titles, though, ideally you would add to your SSD storage. We will be supporting certain M2 SSDs. These are internal drives that you can get on the open market and install in a bay in the PlayStation 5. As for which ones we support and when, I'll get to that in a moment. They connect through the custom I/O unit just like our SSD does, so they can take full advantage of the decompression, I/O coprocessors, and all the other features I was talking about. Here's the catch, though. That commercial drive has to be at least as fast as ours. Games that rely on the speed of our SSD need to work flawlessly with any M2 drive. When I gave the Wired interview last year, I said that the PlayStation 5 SSD was faster than anything available on PC. At the time, commercial M2 drives used PCIe 3.0, and 4 lanes of that cap out at 3.5 gigabytes a second. In other words, no PCIe 3.0 drive can hit the required spec. M2 drives with PCIe 4.0 are now out in the market. We're getting in samples and seeing 4 or 5 gigabytes a second from them. By year's end, I expect there will be drives that saturate 4.0 and support 7 gigabytes a second. Having said that, we are comparing apples and oranges, though, because that commercial M2 drive will have its own architecture, its own flash controller, and so on. For example, the NVMe specification lays out a priority scheme for requests that the M2 drives can use. And that scheme is pretty nice, but it only has 2 true priority levels. Our drive supports 6. We can hook up a drive with only 2 priority levels, definitely, but our custom I/O unit has to arbitrate the extra priorities rather than the M2 drive's flash controller. And so the M2 drive needs a little extra speed to take care of issues arising from the different approach. That commercial drive also needs to physically fit inside of the bay we created in PlayStation 5 for M2 drives. Unlike internal hard drives, there's unfortunately no standard for the height of an M2 drive, and some M2 drives have giant heat sinks. In fact, some of them even have their own fans. Right now, we're getting M2 drive samples and benchmarking them in various ways. When games hit beta as they get ready for the PlayStation 5 launch at year-end, we'll also be doing some compatibility testing to make sure that the architecture of particular M2 drives isn't too foreign for the games to handle. Once we've done that compatibility testing, we should be able to start letting you know which drives will physically fit and which drive samples have benchmarked appropriately high in our testing. It would be great if that happened by launch, but it's likely to be a bit past it, so please hold off on getting that M2 drive until you hear from us. Okay, back to our principles. Balancing evolution and revolution is the second of them. This was definitely a recurring theme with the GPU. We need new GPU features and capabilities. If we only have more performance, it's not really a new generation of console. Of course, many of these capabilities result in more performance. That's part of why a PlayStation 5 teraflop is more powerful than a PlayStation 4 teraflop. But we aren't just looking for the performance. We also need the ability to do something with the GPU that could not have been done before. And we need higher performance per watt. Every time we double the performance of some GPU component, we don't want to find out we've doubled the power consumed and the heat produced. But at the same time, we have to make sure the GPU can run PS4 games, and we have to ensure that the architecture is easy for the developers to adopt. Now, backwards compatibility was handled masterfully by AMD. They treated it as a key need throughout the design process. As our solution to adding new features without blindsiding developers, we made sure that if there were new significant features, it would be optional to use them. The GPU supports ray tracing, but you don't have to use ray tracing to make your game. The GPU supports primitive shaders, but you can release your first game on PlayStation 5 without making any use of them. Before I get into the capabilities of the GPU, I'd like to make clear 2 points that can be quite confusing. First, we have a custom AMD GPU based on their RDNA 2 technology. What does that mean? AMD is continuously improving and revising their tech. For RDNA 2, their goals were, roughly speaking, to reduce power consumption by re-architecting the GPU to put data close to where it's needed, to optimize the GPU for performance, and to add a new, more advanced feature set. But that feature set is malleable, which is to say that we have our own needs for PlayStation, and that can factor into what the AMD roadmap becomes. So collaboration is born. If we bring concepts to AMD that are felt to be widely useful, then they can be adopted into RDNA 2 and used broadly, including in PC GPUs. If the ideas are sufficiently specific to what we're trying to accomplish, like the GPU cache scrubbers I was talking about, then they end up being just for us. If you see a similar discrete GPU available as a PC card at roughly the same time as we release our console, that means our collaboration with AMD succeeded in producing technology useful in both worlds. It doesn't mean that we as Sony simply incorporated the PC part into our console. This continuous improvement in AMD technology means it's dangerous to rely on teraflops as an absolute indicator of performance, and CU count should be avoided as well. In the case of CPUs, we all understand this. The PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 each have 8 CPUs, but we never think that meant the capabilities and performance are equal. It's the same for CUs. For one thing, they've been getting much larger over time. Adding new features means adding lots of transistors. In fact, the transistor count for a PlayStation 5 CU is 62% larger than the transistor count for a PlayStation 4 CU. Second, the PlayStation 5 GPU is backwards compatible with PlayStation 4. What does that mean? One way you can achieve backwards compatibility is to put the previous console's chipset in the new console, like we did with some PlayStation 3s, but that's of course extremely expensive. A better way is to incorporate any differences in the previous console's logic into the new console's custom chips, meaning that even as the technology evolves, the logic and feature set that PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 4 Pro titles rely on is still available in backwards compatibility modes. One advantage of this strategy is that once backwards compatibility is in the console, it's in. It's not as if a cost down will remove backwards compatibility like it did on PlayStation 3. Achieving this unification of functionality took years of efforts by AMD, as any roadmap advancement creates a potential divergence in logic. Running PS4 and PS4 titles at boosted frequencies has also added complexity. The boost is truly massive this time around, and some game code just can't handle it. Testing has to be done on a title-by-title basis. Results are excellent, though. We recently took a look at the top 100 PlayStation 4 titles as ranked by playtime, and we're expecting almost all of them to be playable at launch on PlayStation 4. With regards to new features, as I said, our strategy was to try to break new ground, but at the same time not to require use of the new GPU capabilities. For more than a decade, GPUs have imposed a restriction on game engines. Software handles vertex processing, but for the most part, dedicated hardware is responsible for the triangles and other geometry that the vertices form. That means it's not possible to do even basic optimizations, such as aborting processing of a vertex if all geometry that uses it is lost. PlayStation 5 is a new unit called the Geometry Engine, which brings handling of triangles and other primitives under full programmatic control. As a game developer, you're free to ignore its existence and use the PlayStation 5 GPU as if it were no more capable than the PS4 GPU, or you can use this new intelligence in various ways. Simple usage could be performance optimizations, such as removing backfaced or off-screen vertices and triangles. More complex usage involves something called primitive shaders, which allow the game to synthesize geometry on the fly as it's being rendered. It's a brand new capability. Using primitive shaders on PlayStation 5 will allow for a broad variety of techniques, including smoothly varying level of detail, addition of procedural detail to close-up objects, and improvements to particle effects and other visual special effects. Another major new feature of our custom RDNA 2-based GPU is ray tracing, using the same strategy as AMD's upcoming PC GPUs. The CUs contain a new specialized unit called the intersection, which can calculate the intersection of rays with boxes and triangles. First, you build what is called it's data in RAM that contains there's a specific set of formats you can use that variations on the same VVH concept. Then, in your shader program, you use a new instruction that asks the intersection engine to check a ray against the VVH. While the intersection engine is processing the requested ray triangle or ray box intersections, the shaders are free to do other work. Having said that, the ray tracing instruction is pretty memory intensive, so it's a good mix with logic-heavy code. There's of course no need to use ray tracing. PS4 graphics engines will run just fine on PlayStation 5, but it presents an opportunity for those interested. I'm thinking it'll take less than 1 million rays a second to have a big impact on audio. That should be enough for audio occlusion and some reverb calculations. With a bit more of the GPU invested in ray tracing, it should be possible to do some very nice global illumination. Having said that, adding ray-traced shadows and reflections to a traditional graphics engine could easily take hundreds of millions of rays a second, and full ray tracing could take billions. How far can we go? I'm starting to get quite bullish. I've already seen a PlayStation 5 title that's successfully using ray tracing-based reflections in complex animated scenes with only modest costs. Another set of issues for the GPU involve size and frequency. How big do we make the GPU, and what frequency do we run it at? This is a balancing act. The chip has a cost, and there's a cost for whatever we use to supply that chip with power and to cool it. In general, I like running the GPU at a higher frequency. Let me show you why.